Hey listeners, you are here for another episode of No Priors, just with me and Elad. And there's been a lot going on in earnings and in the technical world. So I think we will start with maybe just one fun thing that seems to have taken flight in terms of music generation. Elad, what do you make of the popularity that Suno and Udio have found?
When you said fun things, I thought you were going to talk about my hats. I have two hats.
We can talk about your hats.
I have my Bitcoin halving hat that I got from Coinbase. So as you see, it's the Bitcoin halving. And then Zaid has these Make AI Great Again hats that he's actually selling. I think it's going to fund his data labeling habit.
It's a lot of hats.
I know. Yeah, that's all I got. That's all I got left, Sarah.
If anybody has read Jared Kushner's book, there's a great bit about how much money they're making from all the MAGA swag. And so, listeners, Elad and I are making hats and tequila for the guests.
Yeah.
But for the low price of one H100 GPU, we will give each of those to you too.
Or a Bitcoin. Either way.
Okay, I'll take the Bitcoin instead. Yeah.
Me too. I know. Yeah. I think we all would at this point. We can check in again in a couple months when the B100s come out or whatever time period. So, So, as you know, there's been some really interesting things happening on the music generation side. And so there's both Suno and Udio, and both seem to be kind of taking people by storm in terms of really interesting music-based models. And it feels like one of those things where it's early, but it's really giving a glimpse of what's coming in terms of the ability to create other types of content. Obviously, the very first content wave, in some sense, was simple text-based things on GPT-3 like Jasper. And then we hit an image gen wave. And that was Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and things like that. And then we had obviously chat come out as sort of a new type of format and interaction modality. And then we had video with things like Pika. And so it just feels like sequentially we're hitting these different formats. And then obviously Suno from OpenAI. And now we have these really interesting music models where you can specify the type of music that you want. You can write the lyrics. It'll add vocals. And so, these really seem to be the two models initially, at least that people are really adopting. And so it just seems like an interesting moment in time from the perspective of look at all these different creative things that people are now empowered to do and look at the different ways to engage. And of course, you could imagine going forward in time and saying, okay, so at some point there'll be voice cloning and I think it was Drake who put out a song, right, where he had 2 or 3 other rappers that he just voice cloned in. And you can imagine a world where you could use anybody's voice, assuming there's permissions and everything else, to generate your own songs and content and other things. So it just seems like a very exciting future world between Udio, Suno, and some of these other companies.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's not obvious here is in media platforms in general, they're like the ratio varies, right? But there are a lot more readers on X or consumers, like people who scroll a feed on TikTok, or not TikTok anymore, I suppose, but whatever it is, than creators. And so I think like one thing that is just like unknown is how many people actually want to create music if you make it a lot easier to, create something that's any good, right? And if the music we get changes. And so I was talking to one of these founders and he was like, everybody should have a personalized soundtrack for their life, but in the voice of Taylor Swift, in the style of Taylor Swift.
Yeah, I already have one of those, but yeah.
So what is yours?
I can't really share publicly, but we can talk about it later.
Okay. Yeah. It's going to be a little bit, I think it's going to be a little bit of a personal thing.
Yeah, that's true.
What else is going on?
I don't know. I mean, what about local LLMs in the Apple release? You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Apple has entered the chat with a release of, relatively small models that are now on Hugging Face and such. And I think it's just worth talking about the fact that what some of the initial open source releases, Mixtral Llama did was create, pretty impressive reasoning capabilities that were open that developers could use. But there's been huge demand for models that actually have, that level of capability, or at least useful capability, in a 1 and 3 billion parameter size that'll fit on edge devices. And of course, like if you enable that, you have a very different latency paradigm in terms of what experiences for a consumer are possible. And then not paying for the compute of inference all the time means you can do things much more easily that are ongoing and passive and proactive. And so I think there's a lot of developer demand, and I think it like foreshadows we should see Apple creating interfaces for running models locally as part of their ecosystem. That's my general prediction.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting because I've seen a number of people building apps recently that have been these Mac or iPhone OS resident sort of exposure to LLMs. And in some cases, it's let me index everything on your computer and let you interact with it or search on it or build an embedding on top of it or set embeddings. Or let me just integrate ChatGPT or other things into your desktop. And there used to be like search bar apps and things like that in sort of prior generations. And so I think a lot of that is going to be really interesting from a user experience perspective. And one can imagine a couple of years from now, that's just going to be something that comes standard on your device, either direct from Apple or through some sort of partnership or something else. Yeah.
Do you believe any of those things can persist independently? Right? Because I'm reminded of like the launcher platforms. Like, if you think about Android as a more permissive platform, people trying to change sort of core user experiences like that at what felt like an operating system level was kind of tough.
I think it depends on whether or not you truly take advantage of the browser and you're also accessing browser-related third-party applications that you're just getting through the web and indexing them or not. And so really it comes down to like, what's the footprint of content that you're searching over in some sense? And that to me is the biggest pivot point in terms of whether you'll end up with something that's going to be specific to the OS company or broader. I think in general, platforms tend to integrate the most valuable things into themselves. And so it's always risky. They do that as a strategy, and every once in a while you see a company that has breakout success, even though it's built on top of a platform. So I think the oddest example of that is Viva. Do you know Viva? They're like a $40 billion vertical SaaS company focused on pharma.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. It was built on top of Salesforce. It was just a Salesforce app. And they were just selling this into pharma, and then it started working, and they eventually swapped out Salesforce in the back end. But they were literally just some like thin layer on top of Salesforce for years. And so that's the only example I can really think of something that's getting truly massive on top of a platform that wasn't then subsumed by that platform. But I'm sure there's other examples too.
Yeah, I think they're like all kind of apples and oranges. Yeah, Viva, sorry, so out of context. I'm like, what does that have to do with AI, man? And like operating systems. Yeah, I think choosing the vertical thing makes sense to me there, right? You've got compliance around workflows for selling to doctors for life sciences that a Salesforce like didn't really have the expertise, or maybe they just didn't see how big it was to attack.
Well, they verticalized. I mean, Salesforce always had these verticals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, what's Salesforce market cap? It'd be interesting to see, like relative to Viva, how much value. So Salesforce is 266 billion. So yeah, Viva is like 20% of Salesforce or something like that.
Yeah, that was worth investing in.
Yeah, I think people also forget that all of Microsoft Office at some point were third-party applications. So in the 80s, there were separate companies like Lotus and others that were providing what turned into Excel. There was a PowerPoint company that was very popular. Before Word, there was Documents that people would buy as separate applications, and then Microsoft just ended up subsuming them into its own distribution platform. And so again, it's a very standard kind of traditional thing to have happen. The default case would be that those things eventually become part of the operating system, or the operating system company. But again, you never know. So I always think it's interesting to see what people do, and can they make it cross-platform, and does that matter, and all the rest of it. The one other thing that I think is interesting about small models is the question of how smart can small models get, and how much can you actually pack into them. And to some extent, if you look at an LLM, there's like 3 or 4 pieces of capability that people care about. There's sort of the reasoning part of it. There's a set of capabilities in terms of what it can do from a synthesis or other perspective. There's the multimodality. The knowledge base or knowledge set is actually resident in the model. And you can only stuff so much into, a 3B model or a 7B model or whatever size you end up eventually running on device. And so that's the other question, is what are the capabilities that you can actually have that are device resident versus which you always have to go out to the cloud for. And obviously devices always expand their capabilities over time because of the microprocessors they have and everything else. But fundamentally, there are going to be limitations. And so the question is, where's that line? And you could probably define that analytically and just say, okay, today, this is all the stuff that's going to get cut off if you just do it on device, and here's all the things that you can do. And as we move up in terms of device capabilities and their ability to provide access to larger and larger LLMs that are resident, what are the capabilities that come with that? And so I haven't really seen that analysis, but that seems like something that should be reasonably straightforward to do in terms of just trying to understand what can you really do on device versus not, and therefore what apps or products can you build that are going to be, device resident.
Yeah, well, I think there's like an obvious analogy to draw to just like the weight of like how much computing is done like on client or in cloud, client server, if you're really old, right? And I don't think it's like obvious that there is any sort of principled answer here, except it's going to vary by application and how quickly, as you said, like capabilities actually fit into a whatever hardware people already have. Because now there are companies doing AI specific hardware already, right? And if you're trying to make something that feels very AI native work, there is a question of like, okay, well, do we try to make the model work? What hardware do we, what compute do we want in the device itself? How much pre-processing do we do to, send less data over the network to large model in the cloud? And so I definitely think there's going to be like a distribution of that compute, just like the religious wars about like, what gets done, on client, on server, in your CDN, whatever.
But in what circumstances do you think that's not just your phone and your watch or something? Like where do you think the new AI hardware will matter, at least from a consumer perspective?
One of the most interesting theories, and we can actually talk about like the Meta AI launch as well, is whether or not you want some sort of passive device that is like continually collecting data about the world from a vision environment perspective, which is why you get like Ray-Ban Meta glasses instead of just like a phone or a watch that's sitting in your pocket, right?
Sure. I guess you could also just affix small cameras to other devices as well. So it just comes down to, do you need a new form factor or not? Although I think it's an interesting area, an interesting direction. And I guess relatedly, like when do you need that extra data or that information? And under what circumstances we'll use it. I mean, it's super interesting, right? I think in general, if I look at the early mobile device products that emerged from it, a lot of them just took advantage of the accelerometer if you were doing fitness, or GPS if you were doing everything from Uber to a variety of other applications. So I do think those sorts of new capabilities from a primitives perspective are super interesting. So, but again, it just comes down to, okay, what are you going to use it for and how and when? And there's also really interesting, unexpected applications of vision to other areas right now. So I'm really know if it's, the Meta thing I think is super interesting. Have you tried the product?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very impressed. Yeah.
Yeah, they enter the race with like multiple different products, like different modalities up front. It's interesting that they haven't actually they haven't pushed it that aggressively into their existing surfaces yet, because they have like unlimited distribution, right? And it's just like Meta.ai, like independent product. But I imagine they're going to phase into it.
Yeah, it seems like you would potentially, and who knows what their plans are, have like a channel or bot on WhatsApp or on, Messenger or on multiple different services that you could just start interacting with to do things for you. And that could effectively be a way to encapsulate Meta.ai as like just another line item or another account that you're interacting with in chat, or another sort of properties they own. But I thought it was really well done. I've been making different images with my kids on the different services, Playground and OpenAI and Meta and everything else. And they really enjoyed the one-click animation as like a feature.
Yeah, I think it's an impressive product launch. And then on the open source side, they've also made a splash where I think one of the things that surprised people is there's an argument generally in research about like, how much do you want to try to change like the efficient frontier of model training, or like do you just ride the curve and scale up? And if you are Meta and you have somewhere between 22,000 GPU clusters and 350,000 GPUs available, then continuing to train past like supposedly optimal points like does improve performance apparently. And doesn't just fully asymptote as soon as maybe a lot of the research community predicted. And so I think it just is actually a point in favor of the very large firms who are really willing to invest against this and don't it begs the question of how important is efficiency. I think efficiency and like creativity in architectural approach is going to end up being really important for lots of different use cases. Like over time, applications are going to want efficient inference. And like really large models are impossible today to serve for the vast majority of use cases from a cost and speed perspective. But if all you're trying to do is a technical demonstration, like this is very impressive.
Yeah, I did really nice work. I guess the other thing on the sort of data compute platform side, while we're talking about all these different platforms, is Snowflake and Databricks and sort of that layer of companies. Do you think you need to own the model as a data or compute platform, or how do you think about these various open source models that these folks are starting to launch now?
One thing that's tricky as an investor or as an operator in the space is like it begins to look like all one blended landscape of competition. So the Snowflake platform hosts a bunch of different models from other players, including, for example, Mistral. And they're also training their own, and their models are available on, for example, like Microsoft Azure, right? And so you've got a huge number of players all in competition somewhere between models and inference. And it's like, I can't tell you how I think it is going to work. I do think that in the immediate term, like it is less obvious to me that they necessarily like these compute platforms necessarily need to own the models, especially if there's a big landscape of open source out there, versus need to demonstrate to customers that and actually have the expertise of let's say like training models and fine tuning them and deploying them and customizing them to different use cases. So I think there's a piece of it that is actually like learning something that they can deliver to their customers and marketing too.
Yeah, it definitely feels like in the long run, there's a bit of a capital scale question, which is if you're focused on the frontier models, at least, you need more and more scale in terms of compute or other things, which means you need more and more money to invest behind it. And that's why a lot of the models seem to have sponsors in the hyperscalers or other sort of large corporations. And so the question is, how long do some of these other players want to keep up in terms of trying to build things that are bigger and bigger? Or do they just focus on a specific subclass of models that are more kind of medium to small, that have more specialized use cases? And so one could argue that in the long run, that's where those types of models should go, is the inference platforms probably provide things that are more in that range. And then the hyperscalers and their partners, a handful of them will be at the frontier because those are the ones that have business models that can actually afford the subsidization of these massive frontier models, with the idea that the ROI pays for itself dramatically later as you scale into more and more intelligence and more applications and things like that. So it's kind of investing far ahead. And the question is, how far ahead can certain companies invest?
I'm sure you've been getting this question, but I get like a stressed out question from investors of essentially like how much money should the world spend on this, and like is it rational? And I think this is an impossible question because should is and like this is a question of people's business decisions, like a very small number of individuals actually, right? And something that feels unique in AI to me is you have these folks who like they really believe in technology and strong intelligence. They can reason about exponential growth. That's something like Silicon Valley people are very proud of, but also all of these people are very capable of. And they have like very high risk appetite. And then, they can control and marshal a huge amount of resources, $10 billion plus spend, $20 billion plus spend if you're Meta every year on GPUs, 30, I think 30 to 35 this year. They may have changed the estimate there against these bets. And I actually think it's interesting to put in context, like this isn't completely unheard of in terms of investment toward some future goal. Like, you and I have talked about chip fabs before and how much they cost. But if you think in aggregate, a handful of players in terms of the hyperscalers are spending almost $200 billion this year on compute for AI. And then you like try to think about the other types of investment in a new ecosystem. Like oil majors spend $80 billion a year. Broadband providers, last few, like it's about $100 billion a year of spend in infrastructure, right? Like CapEx for high speed internet. This is like going back a decade or two. But if you look at railroad freight, like there are years where you're spending a huge number on railroad CapEx. And so I think like the different dimensions you can think about spend are like, well, what is it in overall context? And then, what is that get you over time? I think both these questions are pretty hard to answer. But it's not unheard of in terms of scale.
Yeah, 100%. And again, it depends on your belief in terms of where all this goes, but I think it's notable that the hyperscalers are doing it. And then the one other potential source of immense scale in the long run may be sovereigns, as people want to customize models that are specific to their region or customs or language or culture or whatever it may be.
So there are a few areas of research that have been like debated hotly recently, and one is this idea increasingly of like unlimited context, which I think is like mostly a term for like actively managing context. But you're an investor in Magic. Magic is one of the key players here. Can you talk about this?
Oh, sure. I mean, Magic, I think was one of the first companies to launch a really long context window. I think they launched a 5 million token context window, 6 or 12 months ago now. So it's been a while. And then when Google came out with Gemini 1.5, I think it was a million token context window. And then it seems likely that a lot of people will end up in the 10 million plus range in the next year or two, or some reasonable time frame ahead. And what's happening is with longer and longer context windows, the way that you think about what you put into a prompt changes pretty dramatically, because you can start dropping everything from entire code repos to all sorts of documents if you're dealing with legal, on through to, you kind of name it. You can also drop in all the context of a giant customer support queue, because some of these things eventually get big enough that you can do really significant things with them. I think one of the most striking examples of long context window being important is actually some biology models that have come out recently, where just increasing the context window for things like protein folding seems to really make a big difference in terms of your end result, in terms of the fidelity of that folding. So I think this is going to end up being one of those really significant things. And it reminds me a little bit of microprocessors or bandwidth in the 90s, where each generation of microprocessors that came out had a big step up in things that you could do with it, or bandwidth. Instead of a dial-up modem, suddenly you had a fatter connection, and then eventually you had broadband, and now people have fiber in some cases. And so it feels like a similar thing where there will be a really long period in this, and AI means like 2 weeks or whatever. There'll be a really long, it's going to be much longer than that. There's a really long period where bigger and bigger context windows will matter. And then there'll be some shift where, okay, now we've kind of maxed out what we're really going to be able to do with it. But it seems like a significant shift in thinking around how important this is going to be. And again, in areas that I didn't expect necessarily, like biology. I guess the other thing that people have been looking at, we talked a little bit about context window. We talked a little about compute platforms. We talked a little about the capabilities of small models and where they constrained. The other potential future constraint is energy. So I'm just curious how you think about, if you have a 500 megawatt or gigawatt data centers, like how does the way we think about energy shifts? Like there have been things like job ads posted on the Microsoft website for like nuclear engineering and things like that. And so what do you think happens from an energy constraint perspective? Because you kind of look at it, the first constraint was like chips, and then it was packaging for the chips. And then there's probably going to be some data center constraint where everybody miscalculates how many data centers we actually need. And then energy is sort of related to that. So I'm just curious how you think about future energetic needs.
I think like one supposed coming limit to scale is going to be energy, and that nobody's built like a 500 megawatt gigawatt data center yet. And if you think of it as the equivalent of like a nuclear power plant's worth of energy going toward a single data center, it is quite large. And the basic understanding here is today to train these large models, you need all of the GPUs co-located because there is enough data transfer between different chips, right, between your nodes. And there's a physical constraint on that, in that you need to get that much power to a data center. And I think it's kind of interesting because Sam made the point recently that when you have constraints that require permitting and physical world changes, like you will see a slowdown in terms of how quickly you can go deploy this, right? It's no longer a software engineering problem only. And I think the fear, I think we're likely to work through a lot of these things. But the fear is that some of the potential limits to progress are going to be like, we can't just throw more compute at the problem because it's like physically hard to throw more compute at the problem. Energy data centers, right? And then also, the concept of the data wall, right? Like the number of cheap available tokens on the internet we have used, and now we have to go figure out how to go get more, collect more in the world, or more likely, like, or in combination with generating synthetic data. That still feels like a bits, not atoms problem, and you can solve pretty fast. But you can even see it in the designees for the new DHS safety board, that the AI safety board that just got announced, right? Some of the players are very obvious. So the, Sam and Satyas of the world, but it also includes people who work on energy to this point, and infrastructure security.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I actually found that the news around Microsoft investing 1.5 billion in Abu Dhabi's G42 was super interesting from the perspective of you're effectively setting up a big AI data center. You're starting to sort of democratize or broaden global access to it. But B, you're doing it near an energy center. And so, I think that's really interesting. I think, in general, if you view the last 50 or 70 or 100 years as two sort of competing philosophies around progress and anti-progress, or abundance and scarcity, one of the biggest wins on the scarcity side was really shutting down nuclear power in the 70s, at least in the US, or the ability to add new nuclear power, since 17 or 18% of US power generation today is still nuclear. It's like 70% in France, it's 30-ish% in Japan. So it's still quite significant in some places, but it could have been 70% in the US and a bunch of other countries. And if you would have thought of that large, abundant, cheap resource, and now how that ties into things like compute and other areas, it's a real game changer, right, in terms of capabilities. And so there are solutions. The question is, are we going to adopt those solutions at any point? But these are actually very solvable problems if we choose to solve them, which is why I thought that job posting on the Microsoft website was so interesting.
Yeah, well, and I'd love to see that reversed, even beyond just like general energy needs. If you do think of AI as a strategic issue and a national security issue, not using every energy resource we have and every energy technology we have, like you and I have talked about, generations of nuclear technology that have existed, not deployed in the United States for really like policy reasons. It is yet another dependency that we're creating for ourselves on other countries without needing to, right? It makes the sort of energy dependency even worse to have AI rely on it.
Yeah, all of geopolitics would be dramatically different if we just had a lot of widespread nuclear power. And it's interesting to think of that. And you think of some of the biggest producers being Russia and Venezuela, obviously the Gulf, but, Iran, et cetera. And you think of geopolitical policy. It's kind of interesting to think about how the world would be different if we weren't dependent or as dependent on some of these sources. So anything else we should talk about?
I think we're good.
Do you want to see my hats again?
Yeah, let's see the hats.
That's the other piece of infrastructure where people spend a lot of money in the past, is just sort of hat making,
Yeah.
Millions of dollars a year go into the infrastructure.
The trade is good for anybody listening. We will offer you one branded bottle of tequila or mockquila or whatever you'd call it, and a cool No Priors hat for H100s.
Just let us know.
Okay, that's all we got. Find us on Twitter at No Priors Pod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to see our faces. Follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. That way you get a new episode every week. And sign up for emails or find transcripts for every episode at no-priors.com.